Welcome back to software engineering. So this is the first of two videos in the software organizations module, and it's going to really cover kind of the business side of software engineering, which for a long time to me seemed a little bit sleazy, but basically the crux of all of the stuff in this presentation or this video is about the fact that you have spent a non-trivial number of hours trying to get trained on how to develop software and be good at your job. And so these are basically lead-ins to you being compensated fairly for all of the effort and all of the time and resources you've been putting into getting that training. So in the first 66% of the class, something like that, we really talked about how to generate software in a meaningful way, right? So we talked about how at-scale software is different from generating code for a programming assignment, and it has to kind of go through these very metered sort of steps that are reproducible that many companies use in terms of agile development and processes. So we talked about gathering requirements, we talked about planning and implementing and testing a system, and then we also talked about sort of the cast off for supporting the system after you've actually sent it out into market. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the context around performing all of these activities, right? So none of this stuff is free. You have to pay people to gather requirements, you have to pay people to plan, you have to pay people to test. And software companies don't just sort of operate on unicorns and rainbows and stuff. And so what we're going to be talking about is the actual organization or the business around performing these functions and how it essentially pays for itself and pays for its employees. So throughout the entire semester, we have talked about how very few things are dichotomous in software engineering. Almost everything exists on a continuum. So from things like agile development, you've got Scrum processes and Kanban processes. You've got black and glass box testing. All of this kind of stuff isn't necessarily as black and white as it seems at first glance. And there are two ends of a continuum that kind of give you an idea of the breadth of types of software organizations that exist. And so if you think about one side being extremely traditional kind of concepts of what software engineering organizations look like. So they are the IBMs, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world. These companies typically generate revenue by selling some sort of software product. So they have Windows, they have pick your favorite product off the shelf, and users go and they buy that product or their company buys that product so that they can do their job, and the actual cash that somebody paid for that box that has a CD in it that you install the software, or the download fee for the installer goes back to the software organization, and that contributes to the revenue of the organization. On the complete other opposite side of the continuum, you have what are typically referred to as consultancies. And so many of you, if you have started looking at the job market, particularly in an area like Tallahassee, you've noticed that there are a tremendous number of consultancies compared to traditional software companies. So while there are hundreds of software companies, there are thousands and thousands of consultancies, and these things usually perform software-related services. So these things contain customizations, which we'll talk about in just a moment, or they perform specific tasks for government agencies, so on and so forth. And when these consultancies perform work, what they typically do is they either charge a flat fee for that work, or they charge a billable rate per hour. And so a consultancy is a software engineer billing much closer to a contractor for building a house than a traditional concept of what a software company is. And so as a software engineer, you can certainly fill a role in either of these types of organizations. And obviously there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. So while Microsoft has a traditional sort of organization around things like Windows keys, they also have consultancies that are partnered with them that do things like artificial intelligence. They also have support services that very large companies can pay for. So they have a little bit of both. And so a lot of the larger companies do that, right? They kind of straddle the continuum. They try to get as much revenue from both sides as they can. And we'll talk about how you can do that a little bit. So in general, the way that the split kind of looks from a large software company's perspective is they have a services department which does billable services at either a flat fee or an hourly rate, and they have R&D, an R&D development department that does sort of product development, and then a lot of that is not by the hour stuff. And so you can think about the difference between those two organizations inside of the same company, as one of them is really interested in time entry and keeping track of how much time they're spending on something, and the other really just wants to produce the best code that they can because they want users to actually use the system that they're contributing to. So there are two really big differences between consultancies and what I'm going to call companies, which I really refer to as kind of the traditional concept of software company. And the first one actually has to do with where the business team works. So if you go all the way back to the design and the analysis phase of the software lifecycle, we talked about how basically there are two teams working together. One of them is the software team, they do all the technical stuff. One of them is the business team, and they kind of know how all of the business processes work. For a consultancy, usually the business team doesn't work for the same organization as the software team. So you're working with a bank, you're working with a university, you're working with some third-party company, and that company employs the business team. They're a completely separate entity. With a traditional company, the business team is often a business analyst team that's inside of the same company. So going back to Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, you would have a team of business analysts that understand how people might use Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, and they would provide requirements, they would provide UAT, they would provide all these things for the internal development or software team that works on whatever that project is. A major difference between these types of software organizations is the fact that in one case you have an internal client, and the other you have an external client. So your business team that you're actually trying to implement stuff for works for an entirely different organization. And so the second big difference is how these types of organizations actually generate revenue. So products are basically these commoditized pieces of code. So typically these things are sold by license, and they are created by R&D or traditional software companies. And the idea is you would go and you would create Microsoft Word 1997 or whatever, and then you would sell that. And then in 1999 or 2000, you would have a brand new version, and then people would go and buy the new version because it has shiny new features. And that same idea extends all the way to modern day, right? So as of 5 years ago, 3 years ago, Adobe had very similar situation. You would be able to go out and you would be able to buy a license to Photoshop, and as new versions came out, you would want the new versions, you would go and you would rebuy essentially that same piece of commoditized code. If you've ever used in Vivo, there are tons of products that still function like this, but basically what you're doing is you're buying software as a widget. That's how you can think about it. So while services themselves can be commoditized, so you can build PowerShell or Bash scripts, you can do tons of automation inside of software services. Basically what these things are doing is they're performing very niche tasks for a client. So these things are usually charged by the hour. So somebody will say, I really need you to build a database to store my client data, and then you will build the database, and if it takes you 8 hours, you will give them an hourly rate. They will give you a bucket of hours, and then you get that rate multiplied by however many hours you get approved for. There are also cases where clients will ask for what are called fixed fee arrangements. So basically they will pay you a flat amount regardless of how long it takes you to perform the service. So if you have commoditized services and you have flat fees, the first one you might lose money on, but as you reuse your automated process, when you do the 100th service, it takes you very little resources, and you actually get the same amount as when you did it the first time and it took you a lot more resources. So there are more complex ways of building services, but the idea is that products are really widgets, services are really, services. They're not necessarily tangible pieces of software. They're really customized, tangible pieces of software that perform a very niche thing. So we've talked a little bit about internal and external clients, and it's important to remember that end users are typically, they can be very different from your client. So in the first case, you have a company that is called business to consumer, and what this means is that you have a software organization that is generating code, and that code is really marketed to individual people that want to use that code to perform a task. So things like fitness applications that do daily calorie intake and whatever, that stuff is not necessarily an application that a bank would buy. It's more something that you as an individual would buy. Video games, a very similar story. These are companies that are generating code, and their end users aren't part of this huge conglomerate, and the business team in the development is really an internal client that is then completely different from the end user. And so in this case, you have a business team that basically emulates your end user, but isn't necessarily the same. Now, business to business is a business that generates software, generating software for another business. And so this is characterized by an organizational end user. And so typically this is the external client being the end user, or being very, very similar to the end user. And data management applications are really great examples of B2B products. So things like Canvas, things like banking applications, project management applications, all of that kind of stuff. They're not necessarily for individual use. They're really for teams of people to work together collaboratively to do some sort of business function. So we kind of touched about this in the design video, but basically there are two ways that you can be a software organization that actually generates revenue. The first of these is to provide license fees, and so again, you can think about this like a Windows license, or if you buy video editing software, these are really products, and the license allows you to use that product. Sometimes licenses expire, and so you have to repurchase the license. So even though you have the physical code, you can't necessarily use that code outside of some sort of paid window. And so there are tons of ways to license software, but license fees are basically half or one of the ways that you can generate revenue. The other one is through a billable service. So we've talked about kind of customization concepts. We've talked about how many, I hate the term, but headhunting consultancies basically take software engineers and they place them with government agencies, and then the government agency uses you as a member of their software team, but you're basically leased from some other company. And so all of these things are different types of services that you can perform that don't necessarily directly relate to a software license. So you're basically generating code, and that code is directly owned owned by a client, and they don't necessarily have to pay a recurring fee for the license. They basically just have to maintain the system. So talking a little bit about software customization, there is a humongous cottage industry associated with basically like 15 or 20 core software platforms that are running sort of all over the world. And so some examples of this, Canvas is kind of a small fish in this, in my opinion or kind of point of view, but you also have extremely large companies like Salesforce.com, you have SAP. Basically what these companies do is they provide some kind of platform. And that platform provides extremely basic functionality, but in order for it to actually work, you have to have an internal engineer or you have to lease an engineer to actually customize that platform to perform the business function that you need it to do. So if you're thinking about software customization, it ranges, right? So it could be something as simple as I want to add a field on a dialog box, or I want to add some columns in a database, or it could go all the way to something like SAP or Salesforce, where basically you're buying these giant software Legos and then you're paying somebody to put them together in the correct order and the correct configuration so that you can actually use a system that's created on that platform. So if you go back to the idea of consultancies, there are certainly consultancies that lease engineers. There are certainly consultancies that do kind of one-off projects for clients in terms of web development, in terms of database management. These customization projects, particularly around things like Salesforce.com, are absolutely gigantic revenue sources for consultancies. So I did a little bit of research on Upworks a couple of years ago, and Force.com, this sort of underlying framework of Salesforce.com, even 3 or 4 years ago, was a 6-figure salary situation, even as a kind of freelance worker. So just by doing your own kind of project-to-project freelancing in software customization, you could easily make $100,000 a year. And there were several people on the platform that had done this for years, even before Upwork was Upwork. So software customization is a really huge thing, and if you're not necessarily the greatest sort of source code coder in the world, and you don't necessarily care as much about the architecture of things, you don't necessarily care as much about design and sort of the nuts and bolts, software customization is definitely a place that you can put your knowledge of coding to practice without necessarily going all the way down into sort of those implementation details. So if we kind of zoom out a little bit and we think about customization frameworks that you yourself could create. So if you think about maybe your group project, or you think about an application that you were interested in building with some friends and you're trying to license that thing, one of the ways that you can get sort of recurring revenue after selling a license is you can provide customization frameworks within your application. So basically what will happen is people will get the sort of vanilla application. If it's a good application, typically people will be interested in making that application experience better, particularly for B2B applications. And what you can do is you can have an application that maybe fits 90% of the support that a company needs, and then you can have an entirely separate wing of your company that actually performs consulting services that bridges that gap, right? So as engineers are building the next version and the next pieces that are going to be licensed, you also have consultants that are trying to customize that last 10% for clients that are interested in having a slightly better experience. And obviously that ranges, right? So there are applications that you could build with 50% functionality support, and the rest of it is customization. And basically what this does is it provides you the ability to have what I refer to as semi-recurring revenue. There's always an additional thing that you can do. There's always a a shiny new thing that you can hang on your wall or whatever. And so all of those opportunities pose potential revenue that your company could get. So we talked about fourth generation languages in the implementation module. And this is where revenue ties back to implementation. If you have a customization framework that you have implemented inside of your application that uses kind of off-the-shelf technology, if you're using things like Python or JavaScript, if you're using front-end languages like HTML, it's going to be very, very easy for you to find engineers to staff consultant roles, and you're going to be able to get kind of college-educated people that just kind of want a job and they're very good at that job and everybody's happy. If you write some extremely esoteric customization framework, it's very, very hard to find a person who can staff that position without training them. And if you're only generating sort of 10% value add with your customization framework, but it takes you 9 months to train a person on the customization framework itself, there is not a lot of margin in that work. And then that is a detriment to everyone else in your organization to kind of have that low ROI. So all of the stuff that we talked about up to now is kind of a classical, kind of traditional concept of software licensing and what services are. You have undoubtedly heard of software as a service because we talked about this in the design video quite a bit. But software as a service is certainly an architectural concept, and it's certainly a way that you can build different types of applications. But really, its genesis is around trying to understand a better way of billing clients for software that you are writing. So we talked about how Adobe years ago, you could go to Best Buy or wherever and you could buy a physical copy of Adobe Photoshop. That is less true now, and instead of buying a license, what you're doing is you're paying month over month a recurring fee for access to an online kind of hosted Photoshop experience or any of the other kind of applications in the stack. So this SaaS billing process, the kind of recurring revenue that you generate from software as a service, is related to a much older kind of idea around enterprise billing modules. And what used to happen with these very large sort of banking systems and government agency systems is they would pay an upfront license fee, usually per year or usually per major release. And what that would do is it would provide the software company the ability to actually operate and generate code, and then give that code to the client or give that code to the users. And then in addition, they would pay a separate maintenance fee, which is usually annual, and that maintenance fee would recur much more frequently than the license fee. So as you add new employees, you would have to add new licenses, but as you go year over year over year, you would have to pay additional maintenance fees. That maintenance cost was supposed to be covering bug fixes and new features. So the engineers that are working on version 2, they don't work on version 2 for free, and version 1 has to be in the market for a fairly long period of time before it actually pays for itself. So this additional maintenance cost, the idea was that the maintenance cost would pay for somebody to fix bugs, somebody to maybe generate new features for the next release without hindering your ability to recoup the funds that you spent trying to build the very first iteration of the software. So what happens with SaaS offerings is usually the end users, be they a corporation or a company or just individual users, they have a month-over-month expense, and that month-over-month expense covers hosting fees for the company. They have to have servers that host the services, or they have to pay a third party like Azure or AWS to host those services. And it also covers the cost of maintaining the software. All of the startup Capital, that kind of comes from the cosmos. It comes from wherever it comes from. But these month-over-month fees, they typically pay for continued development, and they pay for hosting and all the other fees, storage fees, and all that kind of stuff. So if you compare software as a service to the kind of traditional concept of licensed software, software as a service is things like Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime, even like we were talking about before, Windows itself has aspects of software as a service. Microsoft is obsessed with calling things whatever as a service. They have platform as a service. They have database as a service. They have all this kind of stuff. So basically what you see is the older style software licensing concept slowly morphing into the software as a service concept because it is nicer to have recurring revenue as an organization, because you can use it to make projections. You can be fairly confident that if you hire a new person, you're going to have enough money to actually pay them, and it is much less kind of volatile than trying to constantly sell X number of software widgets in order to be able to operate. So while Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime, Hulu and Netflix have a very sort of month-to-month kind of arrangement with users. You can also have software as a service that is a year contract or a 2-year contract or something like that, that locks users into a long-term contract that allows the organization to gain enough revenue to actually make projections and plan what the next releases of the software are going to actually look like. So we talked a little bit a while ago about how the startup capital for a company just sort of comes out of thin air if you're talking about a SaaS offering. So if you are trying to pay for the development of something like Hulu or Netflix $9 a month at a time, it's going to take a whole lot of people or a whole lot of months in order to actually pay for the development and the design and the testing effort that are required to actually complete the piece of software. And so while all of these things kind of begin as an idea, so even if you're starting a consultancy, you have to have some kind of idea around how you're going to get clients, what kind of services you're going to offer to those clients. These ideas don't generate revenue on their own, except in kind of off cases. So you have to kind of understand how you're going to get enough money to operate from the very first time you have the idea until the very first time that a user actually pays you. So we've talked about how you can have design specifications that act as contracts, and many times those contracts provide the consultancy enough upfront capital to operate, and it's basically like a pay half up front and then pay half after the work is done kind of situation. But for SaaS offerings, that's not really the case. You're going to get some money as soon as somebody licenses the application, but they're not going to necessarily pay month over month for your idea. They're going to have to actually have something that shows them movies or whatever. So in order to pay all of the people that perform all of these functions that we've been talking about this entire semester, you have to come up with some kind of resources to pay them. And there are basically 3 ways that you can do that, and you can use any combination of these 3 ways. There are many things between the kind of gaps. But the biggest ones are first, working for free. So you could certainly generate some sort of really great platform after you're done with classes at night, or you could work as a software engineer for a company and then work on your own thing on the side, which there are tons of legal issues potentially there. But basically working for free allows you to generate code however you want. The interesting thing about software engineering is that the startup capital for you as an individual is basically you have to have a machine, and you have to have Notepad, and you have to have some sort of compiler. So the barrier to entry is fairly low compared to something like building houses, where you have to have a whole lot of tools and a whole lot of things that you that keep you kind of out of the market if you don't have that startup capital. The problem is that if you try to do this long term, what will happen is either your interest will fizzle out because you're not getting any return on your investment unless you're really, really interested in the project, or you can really run into situations where you cut tons of corners because you're trying to get out of the situation where you're essentially working 2 jobs, and that will lead to an immense amount of technical debt. So if you remember the idea of having a minimum viable product, basically what you want is you want to make sure that if you're working for free for yourself or for anybody else, that's what you're working toward. You're working towards some sort of minimum viable product that you can show to someone that they will be interested in enough that it will generate enough revenue for you to focus full-time on that project. The other way you can do this is by self-funding. So there are tons of companies that aren't necessarily the size of Google or Microsoft that have both services and product inside of them. And how this works is you can generate a certain number of billable hours as a consultant for a portion of your week, and then the other portion of the week is paid for by the markup on those billable hours. So while you may pay yourself $25 or $30 or $35 an hour, you would charge the client maybe $150 or $200 or $225 an hour because of the market rate of your skills. So the delta between those two things will allow you to pay yourself for non-billable work on a product. This is particularly a powerful situation if you can use those non-billable hours to generate product that helps with your services. So we talked about automating services, and if you get into a situation where your product and your services are very aligned, you can actually self-fund all the way, and that's called organic growth. And you can certainly do that. The problem with the approach is that it can take a really long time. So consultancies have to find clients. It's not trivial to find them. And it is not trivial to come up with a product idea that is tightly aligned with a consultancy client. It's kind of a hard thing to do. So the third is kind of the thing that everybody kind of thinks about when they're talking about startup companies. And this is to go out and pursue investors. And so like I was saying, you could certainly do multiples of these or kind of in between. So if you try to pursue an investor with only an idea, without any code or without any working kind of prototype, it's extremely hard to get actual funds without giving up a lot of control. So if you have a prototype and you have a very high margin situation where you believe that many people will be interested in subscribing to whatever service you're doing or buying licenses for whatever application you're building, and you feel that you're okay with giving up 25% or 40% of ownership in that application, pursuing investors makes a lot of sense. And if you think about all of the expansive growth that Facebook has gone under or gone through after receiving investors or going public, it kind of makes sense. But you should kind of be wary because this can also limit not only your ownership in the final product, but it can also limit your ability to actually make cash yourself off the idea that you spent a lot of time working on. And you can give up really critical decision-making ability. So if you get into a fairly rigid contract with an investor and they have controlling stakes, so 50 or 51% of the company, they could try to take your application in a very different direction than what you anticipated or intended. And if they don't have an idea of how the kind of market works around that application, they could severely impact your long-term potential. So if you had the ability to make decisions, you would have made better decisions. Those better decisions would have resulted in a better situation for everybody long-term. So if you wrap all of this kind of stuff together, we come to what's called go-to-market pressure. So it begins with the idea that we basically live in a finite resource universe. You can spend as many hours as you want on whatever project you want, but every hour that you spend is an hour that you have to pay someone, even if that someone is yourself. So if you dropped out of school and you went to work full-time for yourself trying to generate a system, you would have to go out and you have to buy your own groceries, and you would have to have some sort of savings in order to pay your rent and pay for your groceries and pay for your utilities and all that kind of stuff. If you have a limited startup capital, so if you have limited cash in your savings account, you can't necessarily just sit around and dream about your product all the time, and you can't necessarily perform the type of testing that you need to do in order to make your product successful. So go-to-market pressure is this force that gets exerted on you as an individual or the software organization that you're working in to push whatever product they are working on into the market before they run out of capital. So the idea is if you run out of capital, you can't pay anyone and nobody wants to work for free. And so if you get into that situation, you can't generate the code, you can't test the code, you can't generate the diagrams that you need in order to get the product off the ground. You can also extend this idea to actually not only running out of capital, but also not having enough margin. So if you're not making enough money for it to be profitable, then you can also suffer the organization dissolving, all sorts of other stuff. So go-to-market pressure is this idea that people and software organizations at large will naturally kind of cut corners and take on some amount of technical debt in order to get to market so that they can generate revenue and then go back and fix issues later. And many really great software companies are able to do this. However, you have to be very wary about taking on massive amounts of architectural or technical debt in order to just get to market. We talked previously about people who generate like $1 iPhone applications and then they stop support, and yes, they may have $1 million, but they've made no friends in the process. And so go-to-market pressure would kind of imply to you that you could rush to market with a game that does very little and has very little support. You would get that person's $1 and then you would leave, and you don't necessarily have to deal with the technical debt that you carry. But what most software engineers and what most organizations want is a sustainable piece of software, and the ability to maintain the piece of software going forward is directly related to the amount of technical debt that you took on in order to get to market. So rushing to market is often associated with problems down the line. So the kind of way that all of this works together is you start a company or you start a project with very limited resources. So you can think of this as you yourself sitting in your apartment trying to generate a brand new application that does XYZ. If you were to do that full time and you were to quit your job and you were to quit school and you had no scholarship money or whatever, you would have whatever you have in your wallet or in your bank account in order to operate. And so that would start some sort of timer. And at the end of that timer, you will be out of money and you won't be able to buy bread. You'll be very sad. So what you want is you want to get to market and push out version 1 before this timer runs out. And at version 1, your product actually begins generating revenue. So either people are paying for your service, people are paying license fees, people are paying maintenance, people are paying a monthly subscription fee, whatever it looks like. This money starts filling your bank account back up. and now you can either double down and start working more hours and take less work elsewhere. You can hire an additional person. You can do all sorts of things with this revenue and try to improve the piece of software that you have. So ideally, you would go to market with some sort of MVP that doesn't make people too mad. So you think about Pokemon Go is a great example. They went to market with a thing that made people very, very happy for about 2 weeks, and then it made people very, very sad. But they were able to take whatever revenue that they got from that version 1 release, and they were able to reinvest it into a much more viable long-term solution. So this version 2, the idea is that you would add new features that make people happy, and you would fix any stability issues that are caused by that go-to-market pressure. The idea that you have to go to market quickly, else your timer runs up and you run out of operating cash. So there are tons of ways to turn what's called user retention, so the number of people that continue to use your application, into revenue. And you will recognize many of these. So there are things like in-app purchases. So going back to Pokemon Go, if a person is interested in buying essentially fake money for $9 at a time, if your game is good enough, they will pay you $9 potentially 4 or 5 times a week. And their month-over-month expenditure and your month-over-month revenue will be much higher depending on how many people and how many people like the application. You also have things like microtransactions. So these are huge in video games. They're also huge in mobile games. That's kind of self-explanatory. But you also have paid upgrades, which apply to many B2B systems. So if you are using a banking system or using a financial system and you want to upgrade to the latest and greatest version, you don't get it for free. You have to pay for the upgrade. If your application is really good and people want to continue to use it, they will absolutely pay for that upgrade. And so your ability to retain users immediately generates revenue because they don't want to go to a different software system. You also have software as a service. Obviously, it's going to continue to generate revenue month over month if the users are continuing to use it. And if you have like a $1 game that has ads in it, but the $1 game is very, very, very good, people are usually totally fine with ignoring your ads, and you will still generate ad revenue based on however many users are actually actively using the application. So the ability or your ability to retain users ultimately is a product of 2 things. One, how good your application is. So does it have 10,000 bugs? Is it hyper-stable? Is it constantly breaking as you release new versions? And the user perception of that piece of software. This includes things like how much does the person need it? How much does the person want it? Things even like Pokemon Go. As a person plays the game for 2 or 3 or 4 years, it becomes less and less likely that the person will just suddenly stop. If you think about games like World of Warcraft, if you think about League of Legends, all of these kinds of things generate goodwill in the user base over years and years and years. And as you go down the line, it starts off as just kind of a want, and then the more addictive personalities tend to need it more than want it. So even video games can become extremely important to people, and your user retention for those specific users is very, very high. So there are tons of studies about how much turnover exists in mobile application user bases. So basically the idea is people can buy an application for $1 or $5. If the application is terrible and they don't like it, they are very likely to just throw it away and uninstall it from their machine. You as the vendor get to keep the $1, but most of the revenue in these applications is actually in ad revenue. So because the user uninstalled the application, you're no longer getting ad revenue, and now you're kind of sunk. So potentially you have some big bang of cash. Maybe you had 1 million people download a $1 app, but if everybody realizes the app's terrible and they don't keep it for a month, you have basically that $1 million, and that's it. So on the other end of mobile applications, you have things that are called sticky markets. And sticky markets relate to applications that users actually need. So these are financial systems for banks. These are practice management systems for accounting firms and law firms. If they don't have this piece of software, they can't actually do their job, and if they can't do their job, they can't generate revenue. So their ability to generate revenue is based on your ability to generate revenue, which is a great place to be. Sticky markets exist because of user need, but they also exist because of lack of competition. So if you are in a very new space, if you're doing really, really novel work, or if you have really bad competition, you can afford to make breaking changes, you can afford to make bad decisions where maybe somebody that's generating a $1 phone app can't necessarily. So an example of this is if you have kind of a flashy mobile game, and that mobile game has some sort of data breach associated with it that sends out a bunch of emails and passwords, or somehow compromises people's ability to maintain their privacy, it is extremely unlikely that your company is going to live through that if that's their only revenue that they have. So basically what's going to happen is people are going to riot against your application. They're going to uninstall it from their phones, and then suddenly you're going to be left in the cold. If you have a banking system that essentially does the same thing, so you have a banking system and it dumps a bunch of passwords or dumps a bunch of email addresses somewhere that a malicious actor can get them, bad stuff's going to happen to you, right? You're going to have to end up paying massive fines. You're going to pay for theft protection if you remember Equifax. But it's extremely unlikely that you're going to lose all of the business revenue that you originally had. And the reason is the bank needs the banking system. If they just uninstalled the banking system, they would have no ability to do their job. If Equifax just sort of ceased to exist, all of the companies that are relying on Equifax's credit scores to function would suddenly have to go elsewhere. And the second point is that going elsewhere is a non-trivial task. So if you are trying to go from system A to system B, this can take 3 or 5 years. It can take hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to make your business process match a competitor's application, or perform all the customizations on a competitor's application stack that you need in order to actually operate. So usually when B2B software gets replaced, it is kind of an act of Congress. It isn't necessarily a person at the bank decides that they're going to go with software vendor B instead of software vendor A, even if software vendor A has a kind of huge issue, like a security breach. So that's kind of my spiel about how the organization of software companies works and how it kind of looks. Next time what we're going to do is we're going to talk about software licenses, so particularly closed source and open source licenses, and how if you aren't kind of careful about how you incorporate third-party applications into your application stack, you can end up with what are called licensing incompatibilities, and these things can cripple your ability to actually generate revenue because many of these are very restrictive, and by incorporating that piece of software into your application, you are giving up ownership of that application code, or you're open sourcing your application. So that's not necessarily great. So I will see you in the next video where we discuss these things, and I hope that this was mildly interesting. Thanks.